An abridgment of Thomas Manton's commentary on the Epistle of James chapter 4 verse 2. A. You want something but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have, because you do not ask God. In this verse, the Apostle James seeks to address the deep-seated issue of worldly desires, revealing the disruptive and ultimately futile nature of these pursuits. In verse 1, James has already highlighted how such desires lead to both internal and external turmoil, generating strife and tension within the soul and between individuals. Now, he offers a further argument against these earthly cravings, pointing to the dissatisfaction and failure that accompany them. Worldly desires fill the mind with distracting cares and plunge the heart into sin, but ultimately all these pursuits are in vain and bring no lasting peace. When James says, you want something, he draws attention to the force of unchecked desires, which in this context means lusts, those intense, inordinate, and passionate longings that consume the soul. The original term here, often translated as lust in the King James Version, conveys a sense of grasping and relentless desire. But, as James quickly points out, the striving itself is empty, as you don't get it. This phrase can be understood in two ways. Either one never obtained what they sought, or if attained, it was soon lost. The efforts driven by worldly desires rarely lead to true success, and when they do, the possession is fleeting, leaving the soul hungrier than before. James continues with the phrase, you kill. Here, the apostle equates covetousness, the strong craving for what another has, with murder in its severity and destructive impact. Proverbs 1 verse 19 warns of the deadly nature of covetous pursuits, declaring, such is the end of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the lives of those who get it. Covetousness may not always lead to literal killing, but it destroys relationships, hardens the heart, and eats away at the person's integrity. This fierce jealousy can lead to malicious thoughts, and if unchecked, it can evolve into actions that bring harm and sorrow to others. Further, James expands on the problem by adding, and covet. Here, the term suggests both envy and an eager desire to possess what belongs to others. While the New Testament sometimes encourages a positive emulation, as in eagerly desire spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians 14 verse 1, in this instance, it refers to a sinful comparison rooted in dissatisfaction. Worldly emulation, rather than inspiring growth, stirs resentment over another's blessings and leads to covetous scheming to secure those same blessings for oneself. Such emulation is not about virtue but about obtaining external gains and seeking recognition, turning what could be holy ambition into a covetous appetite. But you cannot have what you want. James reveals the futility at the heart of these desires. The longing for worldly success and possessions is a thirst that cannot be quenched. The soul enslaved by these desires becomes insatiable, constantly seeking but never finding true satisfaction. Possessing all the riches and honors of the world, the heart still feels impoverished. As St. Augustine observed, our hearts remain restless until they find rest in God. This passage reminds us that worldly people may possess much but have nothing, because what they own does not nourish the soul nor bring the peace they seek. You quarrel and fight. The striving for worldly gain does not stop at mere desire, but often spills over into conflict. These worldly passions lead to disputes, sometimes even as far as public riots and contentious struggles. However, even with all their strife, James says, you do not have, despite all the outward struggle and the fierce inner longing, satisfaction remains elusive. The apostle identifies the root problem. Because you do not ask God, they fail to seek God's guidance or blessings, preferring their own means over the humility of prayer. This raises a critical question about their approach to prayer. Although they might engage in prayer, their petitions are marred by selfish intentions. James later clarifies, when you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives. These prayers, focused on personal gain rather than God's will, are not true prayers. They do not arise from humble hearts, but from grasping, worldly desires, and as such, they are empty of the faith and submission that characterize genuine supplication. James teaches us that worldly desires often lead to disappointment. When he says, "You want something but don't get it," he reflects God's wisdom in denying our sinful cravings. Sometimes, God's mercy withholds what we so desperately want, recognizing that to fulfill such desires would only harm us. How profound is the blessing of disappointment when it redirects us from the paths of sin. Proverbs 14 verse 14 reminds us, "The faithless will be fully repaid for their ways, and the good man rewarded for his." When God fences our way with thorns, Hosea 2 verse 6, it is often a kindness, restraining us from harmful pursuits and guiding us back to Him. When our hearts are excessively attached to worldly ambitions, it often leads to disappointment. Jesus warns in his parable of the rich fool, who dreamed of greater barns, only to have his soul taken that night. Desires should match the worth of the object. Jesus instructs, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life." John 6 verse 27. We should invest our efforts in that which cannot disappoint or decay, that eternal bread that satisfies without sin or regret. Rather than lamenting over unmet desires, we should bless God for His providence. Disappointments in worldly pursuits can be blessings in disguise. When worldly dreams are suddenly shattered, we are redirected to a higher purpose. Like David, who praised God for providential restraint in 1 Samuel 25 verse 32, we should thank God for guarding us against pursuits that could damage our souls. Sometimes, God's loving intervention helps keep us from becoming complacent, sensual, or worldly, just as Paul found grace in being crucified to the world and the world crucified to him. Galatians 6 verse 14. When we reflect on disappointments, we should examine whether our desires have been too fervent, whether our ambitions too deeply rooted in self-interest. David's excessive love for his son Absalom became a curse rather than a blessing, as misplaced affection led to grief and sorrow. How often do we see that when desires are steeped in self-interest, they seldom bring happiness? People frequently find themselves exhausted and unsuccessful, striving in vain without God's blessing. Psalm 127 verse 2 teaches, "In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat." Success ultimately depends upon God's providential hand, for it is He who brings true blessing. James reminds us that covetousness is seldom isolated. It often brings envy, jealousy, and strife in its wake. Just as virtues come together to build a godly character, sins often form a web that entangles the heart, pulling it deeper into rebellion. One who is covetous is often also envious, unable to bear others' prosperity. Romans 1 verse 29 says that the sinful are filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Self-love lies at the root, breeding covetousness for what is good, envy toward others who possess it, and strife to wrest it from them. Such a heart breaks all bonds of duty and love, violating the very principles of Christian fellowship and charity. In these teachings, James calls us to reflect on the dangers of worldly desire, reminding us of the turmoil it brings within and around us. Our hearts are meant for God, not for earthly passions that exhaust the soul without fulfilling it. Instead of striving after fleeting pleasures, we are called to seek the lasting peace and satisfaction found in God alone. In prayer and humility, we come before God, seeking His will and desiring what He knows is good for us. Only then will we find true contentment, for in God, our restless hearts find their true rest.